All right, so we got a ton of requests to look into this Zachery Ty Bryan situation. If that name doesn't ring a bell, he played Brad, the oldest son on Home Improvement. We've got this stack of articles here about his recent run-ins with the law. And we're going to kind of take a deep dive into these sources and try to figure out what's going on.
Yeah, it's definitely a case that has a lot of people talking, especially given the kind of wholesome image he had from the show and the pretty serious allegations that are being made against him. So we're going to be digging into all these sources, and we want to make it clear right off the bat that Bryan is presumed innocent until proven guilty in a court of law.
Exactly. So these articles really focus on his most recent arrest for domestic violence.
Yeah.
But we're also going to be looking back at his past charges, because it seems like there's a bit of a pattern emerging here. So let's start with what we know about the most recent incident.
Yeah, so Bryan was arrested in Myrtle Beach, South Carolina on January 2nd, 2025 for second-degree domestic violence. He was released on a $10,000 bond, and right now the details are still pretty scarce.
Yeah, there's not a lot of specifics in any of the articles about this particular arrest. But even without all the details, it's definitely concerning when you look at his past. Back in 2024 alone, he was arrested twice for DUI.
Right, the first one was in February in La Quinta, California. And he was also charged with a misdemeanor for contempt of court. Then, just a few months later, in October, he was arrested again for DUI, this time in Custer County, Oklahoma. And the articles mention that he actually apologized to the arresting officer for liking to drink and then refused to take a sobriety test.
Wow. Yeah, I mean, that kind of makes you wonder, like, that's an interesting comment to make to a police officer while you're being arrested for DUI.
Right. You got to wonder if it's maybe a sign of something more serious going on, like a potential struggle with alcohol that might be playing a role in all of this.
That's a good point. So we've got these two DUIs in 2024, and then this recent arrest for domestic violence. And it gets even more complicated when you consider that this isn't his first time facing domestic violence charges.
You're right about that. Back in July of 2023, he was arrested in Eugene, Oregon, after a physical altercation with a woman. He was charged with 2 counts of assault in the 4th degree. But one of those charges was later dismissed as part of a negotiated resolution. And he ended up serving just 7 days in jail instead of the 19 to 20 months that was originally on the table.
7 days. That seems incredibly lenient for a domestic violence charge.
Yeah, it's definitely on the lower end of the spectrum. Now, negotiated resolution basically means that both sides, the prosecution and the defense, agreed to a lesser sentence, usually in exchange for something else, like a guilty plea or an agreement to participate in some kind of program. But the specifics of Bryan's agreement aren't really public.
So there's really no way to know for sure what led to such a short sentence. Okay, so we've got the DUIs, we've got the 2023 domestic violence arrest, and the short jail sentence. But it looks like this pattern might go back even further.
Yeah, unfortunately, you're right. In 2020, Bryan faced domestic violence charges after allegedly strangling a woman, who later actually became his fiancée. For that incident, he received 36 months of something called bench probation and was ordered to participate in a program called Bridges to Safety.
It's on bench probation. I'm not familiar with that term.
So bench probation is kind of like a less intensive form of supervision. You're not reporting to a probation officer regularly, but you're still under the court's watch. You have to follow specific rules and conditions, and if you violate those conditions, you can face more serious consequences.
So it's like being trusted to stay home alone. You don't have to check in constantly.
Yeah.
But there's still rules you have to follow.
Exactly.
So we're seeing a potential pattern here. Multiple DUIs, 2 separate domestic violence charges, and what seems like a history of getting relatively lenient sentences.
Yeah. And all of that is definitely going to be a factor as this current case moves forward. It's a complicated situation.
Right.
With a lot of layers we need to unpack. It's really concerning when you look closer at those domestic violence cases. In both situations, the woman involved was romantically linked to Bryan, and that points to a potential pattern of intimate partner violence, which is a huge problem with really devastating consequences.
Absolutely. Domestic violence is a major societal issue.
Yeah.
And it's not just about the legal ramifications. It's about power and control. And unfortunately, it often becomes a cycle that's really hard to break.
Yeah, exactly. And it's not always just physical abuse either. We're talking about emotional manipulation, financial control, isolation tactics. The fact that Bryan has been accused of this in 2 separate situations years apart is a big red flag.
That's a really disturbing pattern.
Yeah.
And honestly, it makes you think about the victims in these cases. I mean, we tend to focus on the legal side of things, but it's important to remember that there are real people who have been hurt. They might be dealing with trauma, emotional scars, all because of this.
Right, and that's something that we don't talk about enough.
It's really easy to get caught up in the legal details
Yeah.
and forget about the human cost of these situations.
And we also have to remember that domestic violence cases are really complex. Victims often face immense pressure to recant their statements or even downplay the abuse, and fear of retaliation is a huge factor that prevents many victims from coming forward in the first place.
So not only are they dealing with the trauma of the abuse, but then they have to navigate this incredibly difficult and often intimidating legal system.
Exactly.
So we've got these potential signs of substance abuse. We've got this pattern of intimate partner violence. What are we looking at in terms of legal consequences for Bryan this time around?
Well, that's where it gets even more tricky. Each case is going to be evaluated on its own merits, but his past record is almost certainly going to play a role in any sentencing decisions. The fact that he got such a light sentence in the 2023 case doesn't mean that he's going to get off easy this time.
So even though he only served 7 days for that previous charge, the judge in this new case could still impose a much harsher sentence.
Absolutely. Prosecutors and judges look at the whole picture. They consider past convictions. They want to see if there's a pattern of behavior. And in this case, with 2 domestic violence charges already on his record, they might see this new arrest as an escalation, which could definitely lead to a more severe sentence.
Wow. Yeah, the stakes seem a lot higher now. But what about support systems? Does Bryan have access to any resources that could help him deal with potential addiction issues? Or maybe address whatever underlying causes might be contributing to this behavior?
Well, that's a question that we can't really answer with the information that we have.
Yeah, I guess that makes sense.
But it does bring up a really important point. While the legal system focuses on punishment and consequences, there's also a need for rehabilitation and support to help people break these cycles of harmful behavior.
For sure. True justice shouldn't just be about punishing people. It should also be about helping them address their issues and turn their lives around.
Right. Accountability is important. But we also need a system that offers opportunities for growth, healing, and second chances.
I think this deep dive has really forced us to look at this situation from different angles. It's not just about the charges themselves. We're also talking about personal struggles, societal issues, the potential for rehabilitation.
Yeah, it's definitely complex. And it reminds us that these cases are rarely black and white. There's always more to the story than what we see on the surface.
Well said. I'm really interested to see how this all connects back to Bryan's career and how that nostalgia factor plays into all of this. But maybe we should take a quick break and then come back to that. All right, so we've talked about the charges. We talked about addiction and domestic violence. Yeah. How complex the legal system can be. But there's another layer to this whole thing that we haven't really touched on yet, and that's public perception.
Yeah, you're talking about the nostalgia factor. How do we reconcile these really serious allegations with the image we have of Bryan as this lovable, goofy kid from Home Improvement?
Exactly. I mean, millions of people grew up watching him on that show. For a lot of us, he's frozen in time as that character. So it's jarring to see him now facing these charges.
Right. It's almost like we're dealing with 2 different people, the character we knew and loved, and the real-life person who's going through all of this.
Yeah, it's hard to square that wholesome image with the severity of these accusations. I remember watching Home Improvement as a kid, laughing along with his character. It's just hard to wrap my head around it.
I think it speaks to a larger issue of how we view celebrities in general. We put them on these pedestals. We forget that they're human beings with flaws and struggles just like everyone else.
It's easy to get caught up in the fame and fortune and lose sight of that.
And then when they fall short of those expectations, it can be really hard to process.
Yeah, it can be, maybe even make you feel a little betrayed.
Absolutely.
And it's important to remember that Bryan is innocent until proven guilty. But these charges definitely raise some serious questions about his behavior.
And regardless of what happens with the legal case, these repeated arrests could have a huge impact on his life, his career, his relationships. It can be really hard to rebuild trust and reputation.
Makes you wonder what the future holds for him. Will Hollywood give him another chance? Will fans be able to separate the actor from the allegations?
Those are tough questions. I think it highlights how actions have consequences, and those consequences can sometimes be far-reaching.
This deep dive has been quite a journey. We started with these articles about Zachery Ty Bryan's legal troubles, and we ended up exploring so many different things: addiction, domestic violence, public perception, even nostalgia.
It's been a reminder that these situations are never simple. There's always more to the story than what we see on the surface.
Yeah, and I think for me the biggest takeaway is the importance of empathy. It's easy to judge based on headlines, but we need to remember that everyone deserves a chance at redemption.
Couldn't agree more. We don't condone harmful actions, but we can still hope that Bryan finds the support he needs to address his challenges and make positive changes.
So as we wrap up this episode, I want to leave our listeners with a few things to think about. How does our perception of celebrities shape our understanding of their real-life struggles? What role should rehabilitation play in our justice system? And how can we cultivate more empathy and understanding in a world where it's so easy to jump to conclusions and make judgments? I think these are important questions to consider. And hopefully by having these difficult conversations, we can start to create a more just and compassionate society.